Okay, so the world's in a mess. We know that from global warming, and we know that from Fukushima, etc. And I think I'd like to start my lecture by quoting Einstein, who discovered E equals mc squared. The energy of an atom equals the mass of the atom by the speed of light squared. Amazing. And from that came nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And he said at the end of his life he wished he'd been a farmer, because he wished he hadn't done that. But he said the splitting of the atom changed everything, all reality. Thanks, lovey. Save man's mode of thinking, and I stress man. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe, and we're on the way to that. So what I'm going to do is start from the beginning of the nuclear fuel cycle, how they made the bombs, and then into nuclear power, and what that means for us and all future generations and our children. First of all, the fuel for nuclear power is uranium. And in Australia, where I come from, we've got 30% of the world's richest uranium. And uranium has two basic, they're called isotopes. Uranium-238 and 235. This is present really concentrate, okay, in 0.7%, and it must be enriched to 3% for use in nuclear power. This is what's called depleted uranium. It's left, it's waste, no one wants it, and it's free. But guess what? The Pentagon, to their credit, I'm being facetious, discovered that uranium-238 is 1.7 times more dense than lead. And most bullets and shells are made of lead because it's dense and it gets a great momentum. But if you use uranium-238, it's really terrific. It cuts through the armour of a tank like a hot knife through butter. The only thing is it's pyrophoric, so when it hits the tank, 80% of it burns, producing tiny little particles that can be inhaled into the terminal air passages of the lung. It's very, very carcinogenic, and I'll explain how radiation causes cancer soon, and also why we use radiation to try and cure cancer, because people don't understand that, and I understand why they don't. Anyway, America used 360 tonnes of this stuff in Basra and used a hell of a lot in Fallujah. This is all in Iraq. They're selling these weapons all over the world. And in fact, America conducted and is still conducting a nuclear war in Iraq because much of the area is contaminated with this stuff, little tiny powdered stuff. The children pay in the tanks that have been destroyed. Children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults. They get cancer much more readily. Little girls are twice as sensitive as little boys. And the incidence of solid cancers now in Basra has gone up 7 times amongst the children, and also in adults, but amongst the children. And babies are being born so grossly deformed without any heads. That's called anencephaly. I've delivered such a baby. It has a face and the base of the skull and a little nubbin of midbrain, so it can cough, it can cry, it can suck, and then within a week it dies. Those sort of deformities are now so common that the doctors in Basra and Fallujah have told the women to stop having babies. This has been a nuclear war conducted between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the cradle of civilization, where writing began, where law began, the whole thing. But the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years, and you multiply that by 10 to get the total life of it. So therefore, for the rest of time, the people in Iraq who are contaminated, that for all the generations to come, will have a very high incidence of cancer, leukemia, and genetic deformities. Hands up those of you who knew that. Well, this is your government and your money, and you paid for it, and they're still doing it. I can say Australian, using Australian, they're still bloody doing it. How dare they? This is a war crime. And there's a huge literature in medicine about uranium because we used to, in our ignorance, treat patients with it sometimes until we learnt about it. It's a heavy metal, so it causes renal damage, but it can cause kidney cancer, bladder cancer. It goes to the bone where it causes bone cancer and leukemia and the like. So that's the first thing. It's called depleted uranium. It's not depleted. Well, it's depleted of this, that's all, but it's nasty stuff. Now, uranium decays to a series of what's called daughter products, not sons, notice, daughters. It's all very sexist, this nuclear stuff. One of them is radium. And who discovered radium? Come on. Madame Curie. She stirred pitch blende, and out of that she refined radium. Radium is a very carcinogenic, and it's a bone secret, goes to bone. She died of what's called aplastic anemia because all her bone marrow died. She couldn't make any white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets anymore. She was so radioactive she had to be buried virtually in a lead coffin. Her daughter died of leukemia too. So we know from way back that radiation causes cancer. We've known forever. Another nasty one is radon gas, and a lot of houses in the northeast, they've got cellars and the radon gas seeps up from the cellar, and radon gas is now deemed by the American Public Health Department, etc., to be one of the most potent carcinogens that we know. Another one is polonium. And do you remember that Russian guy called Litvinenko? I think someone didn't like him, so they had tea with him at Claridge's and dropped a bit of polonium in his tea. It's a potent poison, and within 2 weeks you develop what's called acute radiation illness. Now, if you get a big dose of radiation, like at Hiroshima or Nagasaki or whatever, the actively dividing cells of the body die, so your hair falls out. It's like getting chemo. You get terrible ulcers in your mouth and the whole of your gut. You get vomiting and diarrhea and nausea. And the platelets die, which cause clotting, so you die of massive bleeding and infection, and that's what he died of. It's great gear. And it's also a gas. So the thing that really causes cancer in smokers is actually polonium, because there are little tiny hairs on the tobacco leaves which concentrate the polonium. And when you breathe in the tobacco smoke, there's turbulence at the bifurcations of the air passages. Like when you're in a plane, there's turbulence, and the polonium concentrates in those areas, and that's where the cancers tend to develop. Okay? Now, so when you mine uranium, this is all left behind, and it's usually done on Indigenous land, Navajos, Australian Aborigines, and we don't really care about them at all, do we? No? We used to slaughter our Aborigines, we used to poison their water holes, we used to throw them over cliffs. We were revolting. And in Tasmania, we killed all of the Aborigines. We don't talk about that. We've got a Prime Minister who calls it black armband history. We don't discuss it. And I'm so ashamed. You did a lot of the same things to your native Indians. But this is all called tailings, and it's all left on the ground. Now, if they buried it back in the ground from whence it came, it would be okay. But they leave it around so that people are breathing the radium. The radium concentrates in their food because it's like calcium. Gets concentrated in the green vegetables and the like, and the polonium. So the people who live near uranium mines have a higher than normal incidence of cancer and congenital abnormalities. In the past, 50% of men who mined uranium died of lung cancer because they were inhaling radon, they were exposed to radium, etc. We've never followed our uranium miners up in Australia. We don't want to know. If you don't want to know and you don't want to pay compensation, don't do the study. All right, now I want to describe the forms of radiation. There are X-rays. Hands up those who've never had an X-ray. Okay. Hands up those who get... Yes, you have. Have you ever had your teeth X-rayed? Hands up those who get a dental X-ray every year. That's medically contraindicated. Do not get your teeth X-rayed. My ex-husband was a radiologist. They buy very expensive equipment and they have to pay for it. Every X-ray you get is cumulative and adds to your risk of getting cancer. Do you understand that? Never walk through those X-ray machines in the airport. Know that fetuses are thousands of times more sensitive to radiation than adults. So if you have to have an X-ray, doctors are not God, although we play God, but ask, why do I have to have an X-ray? And if you're not satisfied with the answer, do not have it. You're allowed to say no. A lot of doctors practice defensive medicine. Your Honour, here's the X-ray. Don't do it. Now, if you've got a cough and you're coughing up blood, you've got to get an X-ray. CT scans give you a hell of a dose of radiation. Do you know they're taking newborn babies and doing a whole-body CT scan on them, and you get a really high dose? When you get a fluoroscopy and you have stents put in your heart, you get a high dose from that. A lot of the cardiologists these days are developing cancer because they also get exposed when they're doing the fluoroscopy, which is using X-rays. So what I'm telling you is, don't get an unnecessary X-ray only if you really, really need it, and then it's important. If you have pneumonia, we have to make the diagnosis, all right? Now, X-rays are non-particulate. They go straight through your body, so when the radiologist says, breathe in, hold it, and runs out of the room and hides and go click, that's the moment you get damaged. It doesn't stay in your body. Then there's gamma radiation, which is like X-rays, non-particulate, given off by many of these elements from uranium and many that are made in nuclear power plant. I'll get into that in a minute. So that goes straight through your body too. The people in Fukushima had a hell of a dose of external gamma radiation that went straight through their body. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission and your nuclear agencies only look at gamma radiation. They don't look at what's called alpha and beta. What's that? Well, alpha is actually particulate. Here's an atom. That's the GE symbol, makes good things for life, right? GE, like stoves, irons, washing machines, nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. They're a wicked company. Wicked. Anyway, here's the atom, and an alpha particle is composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and it's dense in mass, it doesn't travel fast, so a piece of paper will block out, here's a piece of paper, block out an alpha particle. It doesn't enter through the skin because the skin is made of many layers of dead cells, but if it's in your body, like if it gets into your lung here, the alpha particle only travels a very tiny distance, and within that volume, most cells die because the radiation is so high. But on the periphery, as radiation decreases with the square of the distance, some cells remain viable, and those cells are likely to be mutated and develop cancer. So that I'm going to talk about plutonium soon, but plutonium, 1/1,000,000th of a gram, if you inhale it, will give you cancer. 1/1,000,000th of a gram, okay? Then there's beta radiation. That's just an electron. It travels further. Tritium, for instance, which is radioactive hydrogen, is a beta emitter. You call it beta, I call it beta. You say tomato, I say tomato. Anyway, so they're the four sorts of radiation, and they all do the same thing. How do they cause cancer? Well, you know, your body's made of trillions and trillions and trillions of cells. And in every cell, there's a nucleus with chromosomes. And there's a pair of genes on each chromosome called on one chromosome, or one pair called the regulatory gene. And what happens is, if a gene is hit, that time by an alpha particle, an X-ray, a gamma ray, or whatever, it's a Russian roulette, it either dies, the cell dies, or the DNA, which is the deoxyribonucleic acid, is damaged biochemically, and it will sit quietly, and you don't even know that you've had a mutation in a cell in a gene. Maybe by a single alpha particle hitting a single gene in a single cell. And the time it takes to develop cancer is any time from 2 to 80 years. And the cancer doesn't wear a little sign. You get a lump in your breast, you think, don't like that, you know. And then the doctor says, well, we'll do a needle biopsy, pulls out some cells, and you've got cancer. The cancer doesn't wear a little flag saying why it was made. Don't forget we live in a chemical soup, 80,000 toxic chemicals we live with every day, which are infiltrated into our clothes, our furniture, our cleaning stuff in the kitchen, the whole thing. It's up to us to prove to the chemical companies that these chemicals are dangerous, not for the chemical companies to prove that they're safe before they use them. That's wicked. I speak now as a physician trying to save lives. How dare they cover us with chemicals, most of which are never tested for carcinogenicity. It takes 1 year for the EPA to test only 5 chemicals to see if they're carcinogenic with the rats, and it takes a long time to watch the rats and see what they die of and then work out how many died and the like. Now, and what you need to know is that the radioactive elements I'm going to describe work synergistically with the chemicals. Hands up those who know what synergism is. Okay, so it's not 1 plus 1, one chemical plus one radioactive element equals 2, doubles the rate of cancer. It might be 1 plus 1 equals 10, 10 times the cancer. That's called synergism. They potentiate each other. And so one day, instead of the cell just sitting there, it divides into 2 by mitosis, and then it goes berserk. And it produces trillions and trillions and trillions of cells, and that's a cancer. And we usually can't stop that cell growth. And cancer cells are very invasive. They'll break off from the cancer, get into a little blood vessel, a capillary, and go up to the brain or to the lung. And so the cancer, and they get into the lymph vessels too and spread throughout the body, so that you get secondary cancers or metastases. And cancer's like a parasite. You see the body withering away, and the cancer thrives. And the patient dies, and the cancer dies. So in other words, it takes a single mutation in a single gene in a single cell to kill you, and you don't know it's happened. And we tend to wait in our offices for patients to appear with their cancers or their leukemias and treat them with terrible, horrible chemotherapeutic agents and radiation therapy that kill cells. And because cancer cells really reproduce very fast, they're very sensitive to radiation. That's why we use radiation to try and kill the cancer by focusing the radiation specifically on the cancer. But sometimes, and not infrequently, patients who are cured of their primary cancer, like children with Wilms tumour, which is a kidney cancer, later in life develop a second primary cancer because normal cells around the cancer have been affected and the gene's been mutated. You with me? Okay, so that's why we use radiation to treat cancer. Now, so, you know, the incubation time for a cold, if I sneeze on you, is 2 days, and then you're sneezing. And that's the ace up the sleeve of the nuclear industry. It takes so long to get cancer. The cancer doesn't identify itself. How do we know it does it? Because we've looked at the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all sorts of people who've been irradiated. We know damn well that radiation induces cancer. All right. Now, the next thing is, when they mine the uranium, they enrich it to 3%. So you've had an enrichment plant in Paducah, Kentucky. And what they do is they turn the uranium into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and they have thousands of micropore filters made of nickel, with tiny holes, and they force the gas through, and on one side stays the U-238 because it's a larger atom, the other side 235. And over a cascade of these things, eventually you get 3% enrichment. Iran is enriching uranium. You can't make a bomb until you've got about 80% enrichment. They say they don't want to make a bomb. They probably don't, but why shouldn't they have bombs if Israel's got 200 to 400 nuclear weapons? Or America's got, how many have you got now? About 8,000 nuclear weapons. You can't, it's what Jesus said, see not the mote in the other person's eye, look instead for the mote in your own eye. You have to be responsible and conscientious and moral. Otherwise, if you're immoral, other countries will copy your immorality, which is what is happening right now. Okay, now the thing is that this is very energy consuming, and it took two 1,500 megawatt coal-fired plants to enrich the uranium. Now, you know they say nuclear power is clean and sustainable and green. Not true, because the infrastructure underlying a nuclear power plant produces a hell of a lot of CO2. Mining. The trucks are about as big as this room. They're huge, huge amounts of fossil fuel, more fossil fuel to enrich it. And they've got hundreds of miles of pipes that transfer the uranium hexafluoride, and it's a very hot gas. So next to these pipes are other pipes containing CFC gas. What's CFC gas used for, or was? What? Yeah, in sprays, refrigerator. And we found that CFC gas, when it rises to the stratosphere, destroys the ozone. And we don't have much ozone in the southern hemisphere in the summer. And Australians, they like to lie in the sun and go brown like the Aborigines, although we're very racist. And the incidence of the incidence of melanoma in Australia is 1 in 9. I think it's 1 in 93 here. And we have a lot of skin cancers. The old people look ghastly. And the dermatologists are actually patrolling the beaches and telling the young kids to put their clothes on, because the girls are now sunbaked with just their bottoms on, their breasts. They think that's, that's the latest thing. But it's inappropriate. It's medically contraindicated. So now CFC is, I think it's 100 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And of the CFC 114 gas that gets into the atmosphere in America, 92% comes from this enrichment plant to enrich uranium. CFC gas has been outlawed by the Montreal Protocol. No one uses it anymore. They use HCFC gas, which is slightly less toxic to the ozone than CFC, in the spray cans. Never use a spray can again. Never use a spray can, okay? Don't use aluminium cans. You call it aluminum, because to make aluminium is an extraordinarily energy-consuming process that creates lots of carbon dioxide. Don't drink Coke anyway, because it's horrible gear. But don't use aluminium cans, and they all should be recycled. Anyway, so the nuclear industry has been, quote, grandfathered out of the Montreal Protocol, so they're allowed to do it. You see? I think they've closed Paducah down recently, but, it's enormously energy consuming. Don't ever let them say nuclear power's clean, green and sustainable. Now, when they've enriched the uranium, they make it into little pellets, like little pieces of chalk, and they have a fuel rod 12 feet long and an inch or two wide, made of zirconium. And they pack these pellets into the fuel rods, and they take them along to a nice nuclear power plant. And they pack 100 tons of uranium in the rods into the core. And it's all submerged in water. And when the control rods made of boron that control the rate of neutrons shooting out from the uranium atoms, they do all the time, this thing reaches critical mass. It doesn't explode, except Chernobyl did. in extraordinary circumstances. The nuclear industry don't call it an explosion, they call it an excursion. But the euphemisms that are used are quite extraordinary. Anyway, so this reaches critical mass and it's very hot. So it boils the water. And steam is created, which is taken off by a pipe, which turns a turbine, which generates electricity. So all a nuclear power plant is designed to do is to boil water. As Einstein said, nuclear power's a hell of a way to boil water. He was right. He was right about most things. Now, this has to be cooled continuously, so nuclear reactors use 1 million gallons a minute of water to keep them cool. 1 million gallons a minute, so they're incredibly intensive. And you know California is in a terrible drought now. In France, during a drought, the rivers dropped so low and they were so hot that they couldn't use the water to cool the nuclear reactors. Then you're in trouble. Now, when the uranium fissions, it makes a whole lot of new elements. And one of them is cesium-137, which lasts for 300 years. And it's a potassium analogue, so the body thinks, oh, it's potassium, and our cells are rich in potassium, so it goes to all the parts of the body, but it tends to concentrate in the endocrine glands, the thyroid, the pancreas. It also concentrates in heart muscle. So in Chernobyl, little children are having heart attacks and dropping dead. Thyroid. It can cause thyroid cancer, like radioactive iodine as well. It can cause hypothyroidism. You know, when it's called myxedema. If you've got hypothyroidism, your hair falls out and you don't lose your sex drive and your periods stop and you're very slow and you eat a lot and get fat. Hyperthyroidism is when your eyes stick out, like, who is that funny guy? What? Yeah, Marty Feldman. His eyes stuck out and your heart beats like crazy and your blood pressure goes up and you can die from hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease. Anyway, this is nasty stuff. It also causes muscle cancers, rhabdomyosarcomas. And on Long Island near Brookhaven, where they had a meltdown and a lot of this got out, about 19 children had rhabdomyosarcomas. We call them rhabdos, and they die. Then there's strontium-90. That's a calcium analogue. So calcium goes to teeth and bones, and if you've got a bone with strontium-90 in it, that's the femur, it can irradiate a bone cell to cause osteogenic sarcoma. Nasty. Teddy Kennedy's son, Edward, had one of those. He had his leg amputated. They generally spread to the lung. They're usually pretty fatal. And they can change a white blood cell so that the white blood cells proliferate like crazy. They're immature, and that's leukemia. Leukemia means white blood, and so people start bleeding and having infections and dying. Strontium-90 lasts 300 years. Then there's tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen, and the nuclear industry says, oh, tritium is fine, it's only radioactive hydrogen. But it forms H3O, tritiated water. And if you live near a nuclear power plant, nothing impedes the escape of tritium except gold. It gets out of everything, plastic, glass, lead, metal. And so tritium's all the time escaping from nuclear power plants into the water, cooling water, and the air. We've found that children living within 5 kilometres, now you don't use kilometres, do you? 2 miles, 2.5 miles, from a nuclear power plant, children under the age of 5 have double the incidence of leukemia and a high incidence of solid cancers. Oh, but that study was done in Germany and France and England. So your NRC, it's doing its own study now because it doesn't really trust those studies. Yeah, you're not allowed to ask questions, but what?
Cooling water is being affected?
Of course, yeah. The cooling water is relatively radioactive when it gets out into the river, Susquehanna River from 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island was built 13 miles from Hershey's Chocolates. It had a meltdown. The milk, and of course that's the richest dairying area in America because the chocolates are made of milk. The milk was so full of radioactive iodine, they powdered the milk for 8 weeks because radioactive iodine has a half-life of 8 days and it lasts for, about 6 weeks. So they powdered it. And then they used it for the chocolate, except all this other stuff got out too. No one knows the ground measurements of radioactive elements where the cows graze near Hershey's. I've said right from the beginning in a debate with Ed Markey and a lot of people in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, don't eat Hershey's chocolates. And the townswoman came up to me and she said, "Did you say that on purpose?" And I said, "Yes, I'm a doctor." They haven't sued me. Well, they wouldn't, would they? Because then it would get out, all the information. Don't eat Hershey's chocolates, all right? Don't eat and don't give them to your kids. All right, so the next thing is radioactive iodine, and then there's plutonium that's made. I'm only mentioning a few, and I'll show you a chart later with all of them. There are several hundred made. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. These are beta and gamma. That's beta and that's beta. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. 1/1,000,000th of a gram can induce cancer. Its half-life is 24,400 years, so it's around for 500,000 years. Right? Every reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year, and if you want to make yourself a nuclear bomb, all you need is 5 pounds of plutonium. 5 pounds. So you are proliferating nuclear weapons by selling nuclear power plants all over the world. Saudi Arabia, they're going to have nuclear power plants and they're talking about getting nuclear weapons now. And every day they're beheading people or they're chopping hands off if people do something nasty. And they're best friends with America. How come Saudi Arabia's one of your best friends? Because they've got oil. Why is this nation a huge, what am I looking for? Colonial power with military bases in almost every country of the world. How dare you? How dare you? Who do you think you are, the world's policeman? Oh, they talk about American exceptionalism. You're only exceptional in making weapons. That's what you don't hardly make cars anymore, and all your jobs have gone off to China. What's America exceptional in? Do you know?
Making their people really sick.
McDonald's. Yeah. No, forget about food. I mean, we're about to blow up the world, so, 67 cents out of your every discretionary tax dollar goes to the military. Lockheed Martin, they're stealing your money. Boeing, make planes, yeah, they make missiles and anti-ballistic missile systems. They're weaponizing space now so they can fight war from space and, quotes, affect very many kills. It's called High Frontier. Northrop Grumman, Raytheon. And you don't even have a free healthcare system. Don't talk about single payer. Talk about free healthcare like every other civilized country has in the world, like we do. My friend broke her patella the other day into 8 pieces. She went to hospital, had the best orthopaedic surgeon in Sydney, an anaesthetic. She was in for 5 days. Guess how much it cost? 0. That's where our tax dollars go. That's where your tax dollars should go. Huh? Oh, am I a socialist? Well, Jesus was a socialist, let's be frank. Right? Leave thy worldly goods and follow me. It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Okay, that's a little lesson in politics. Now, okay, so all the arguments are made, but it's terribly hot. Now we're going to get into Chernobyl. In the middle of the night, a man who's in charge of Chernobyl, and there's a thing, I want to talk about the bathtub curve first. Nuclear power plants are like people. So there's the bathtub curve. When you're just born and in infancy, you're vulnerable to all sorts of diseases and infections, although now because of immunisation, don't tell me you're against immunisation or I'll have a fist fight with you. Because of immunisation, people don't tend to die. But if you go to the old graveyards, there are lots of tiny little tombs of children who died of diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, you name it. And we've eradicated them. And I don't think young women understand that because they've never seen these diseases. A child trying to breathe with diphtheria. My great-aunt died of diphtheria. Well, at least we've got rid of those, and meningitis now too. But anyway, children are very vulnerable in the first few years, and as middle age and stuff, you're pretty okay. And then when you get to old age, your pipes get rusty like mine. I've got a big plaque in my aorta, and I'm nearly 77. Same with nuclear power plants. They're very vulnerable in the first year or two of their life, then they settle down, and as they get older, their pipes get fragile, they're embrittled, they tend to break, except that your NRC is extending the lives of nuclear power plants from 40 years from which they are designed for another 20 years because you pay for everything. You pay for the mining of uranium, the enrichment, the Price-Anderson Act, insurance, you pay for that. You virtually pay for the construction of the reactor, but then the utilities get the reactor and they make $1 million a day selling electricity. So it's good for them to prolong the life of the reactor because they make more money. Then you're left with radioactive waste, which lasts for 1 million years and it's got to be kept cool for a long time. You pay for that too. So it's a socialised industry. And so is the weapons industry. It's socialised. It's made by your dollars. So therefore you live in a socialised country. You have socialism in America for the nuclear industry and the weapons industry, right? And all of the rest of you, you have to be capitalists. That means you can't afford health care, and you're struggling and too bad for you. I've got to fill out all these forms, insurance companies. Insurance companies shouldn't be in medicine. We're not here to make money. We're here to serve our patients, and if our patients can't afford to pay, they'll give us a chicken or they'll give us a cake because we're here to help them. And medicine is not about making money. So the insurance companies have to get the hell out of it. Hillary Clinton was elected, oh no, she wasn't. Her husband was elected to do that, but she didn't do it. Okay, so what happened was Chernobyl was only 3 months old. And there was this man who was a specialist in hydroelectricity, and he did a crazy experiment in the middle of the night. And there was a huge explosion, and the control room filled up with white dust, and his 2 young men who were helping him, he said, go out and see what's happened. They came back and they said, it's gone. He said, what's gone? They said, the reactor's gone. He said, don't be ridiculous. Go out and have another look. They came back and it was gone. It had exploded. And because the moderating rods were not made of boron, they were made of graphite, like lead in a pencil, it burnt tremendously hot, lifting the isotopes into the stratosphere, which circulated around the globe for days, weeks and months. One stupid man, and as someone said, name me a power plant that makes electricity that will devastate a nation. 40% of Europe is now radioactive. I don't buy European food because I don't know where the food is coming from. And I didn't explain the chain, the food cycle. These elements concentrate in the grass by orders of magnitude, 10 to 100 times or more. Then the cows eat the grass, and I'm no good at cows, but they have an udder. And they eat the grass, and so the strontium-90 concentrates by orders of magnitude in the cow's milk, and then the children drink the milk, which they should do. I don't quite understand all this dairy business because breast milk's for babies and it's the best thing they can possibly have, etc. But then we stand at the apex of the food chain, and these elements concentrate most highly in our bodies. Now, you can't taste strontium-90 in milk. You can't smell it, and you can't see it. These things are invisible. You don't eat a piece of fish that came straight across from Fukushima and is being sold here. Where are we? We're in Florida. Yeah, your fish are probably okay because that's the Atlantic, right? But the Pacific, I'll tell you about that in a minute. You don't say, I can taste the cesium in this fish. So it's invisible to the senses, and that's another ace up the sleeve of the nuclear industry. So it's called bioconcentration. Now, what was I getting on to? I've lost my... What? Oh, yeah. So this thing exploded. So I've gone through... What happened was... the bathtub, yeah. The Russians and Gorbachev denied the accident for 10 days. The radiation was picked up in Sweden. Swedish said, what's going on? And then it came out. But for 4 years, no one studied it, no one did anything. And then they started to look. And then they started to see thyroid cancer and all sorts of diseases. And I'll talk you through all of the diseases that Chernobyl caused. Now, your nuclear industry, no, first of all, the World Health Organization is allied with the International Energy Agency, the IAEA, whose mission is to promote nuclear power around the world, and by doing so, actually promote nuclear weapons, but they don't say that. So, but they've signed a contract with WHO to say WHO can't ever examine the medical consequences of a nuclear accident unless the IAEA says they can. So the WHO has never looked at Chernobyl and never looked at Fukushima, and they say only 60 people died at Chernobyl. Now, I would say that it's immoral, unethical, and criminal for scientists to lie. If we lie in medicine about our patients, we could kill them and we would be deregistered. And when I hear Rush Limbaugh and these characters just promoting, spouting lies the whole time about global warming and the like, he should be put in jail because the Earth is in great danger. It's in great danger. And as Elizabeth Warren says, all the people in the Wall Street who brought about that terrible crash, they should be in jail too. Anyway, now, so after Chernobyl, finally the Russians and epidemiologists and doctors wrote a whole series of papers about their patients and what they were seeing. And these papers were then translated from Slavic into English and published by the New York Academy of Science. And by now, over 1 million people have died because of Chernobyl. Over 1 million. So 28 years after the accident, 50% of 13 European countries are still highly contaminated with long-lived radioactive elements. Before Chernobyl, 80% of the children in Belarus were healthy, and now only 20% remain in good health. A lot of the children suffer from premature aging, which is what we call progeria in paediatrics. I'm a paediatrician, and they get very wrinkled skin, they go bald, they start having heart attacks and strokes when they're really young. Millions of people are exposed to very high radiation doses from very short-lived elements. Now, the elements that only last days, they're very radioactive and then they decay. The long-lived elements, they are too, but it's a short... So if you're immersed in the cloud of radioactive elements on the first few days, if you're near a nuclear power plant, where's your closest reactor? Tampa, Florida. Is that near you? Yeah. How far?
2 hours.
2 hours? How many miles?
70.
Yeah, so you're at great risk. And if there's a meltdown, what do? Well, they say you go inside and shut the windows. They say... Or you evacuate. Well, how do you get your kids out of school? And, you know, it's just hideous. And you're breathing this stuff in all the time, and the sirens are going off. For 4 months after the accident, 400 million people lived in highly contaminated areas. Now, there are 2 reactors at Indian Point, 35 miles from Manhattan. The terrorists who flew into the World Trade Towers were actually going to fly into the Indian Point reactors, but they thought they were protected by anti-missiles that would hit them, so they didn't. They went into the world and only killed 3,000 people or so, instead of contaminating the whole of New York and the financial capital of the world. So the country, Europe's covered with all of these things: plutonium, cesium, strontium, technetium, you name it. There's an element called plutonium-241, which lasts for about 4,000 years, but decays to one called americium-241, and these are alpha emitters, which is much more soluble than plutonium-241 and very readily incorporated into food and is highly carcinogenic. So the contamination in Europe will become increasingly radioactive over time. Am I going too fast, or are you with it? Plutonium-241 decays to americium-241. Okay, so there was a very high incidence of cancer in the children. Premature aging, there are a lot of cataracts. When you're exposed to radiation, you get cataracts, and a lot of birds in the exclusion zones around Chernobyl and Fukushima have cataracts. Osteoporosis, arteriosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, because cesium concentrates in the pancreas, which produces insulin. Okay, what else? Of course, radiation depletes the immune system, so there were tremendous amounts of infectious diseases like flu and pneumonia and all sorts of diseases, which we normally can keep under control, and those people died. The children who were in utero in Sweden at the time and Sweden's done this study, have lower than normal IQs. You're Swedish, I can see you nodding. And because neonates are very sensitive, and the developing brain is very, very sensitive to radiation. Many children have abnormal EEGs, and it's noted that 45% of babies in utero in Hiroshima and Nagasaki also experienced intellectual retardation. Babies were born with tiny eyes called microphthalmia, and retinal pathology, thyroid cancer. In Belarus, 7,000 children have developed thyroid cancer. In Fukushima, it's about 110 now who've developed thyroid cancer. The normal incidence in children is 1 or 2 per million. But in Japan, they say it's not because of the accident. The lies are just extraordinary. Congenital aberrations, well, I'll show you some slides in a minute to show you what it looks like, but the number of congenital malformations range from 12,000 to 83,000 children born after Chernobyl. There are homes full of grossly deformed children that we've never seen in the history of paediatrics before. And then there were the liquidators. They had 600,000 men they brought from all over Russia, most of them in the army, and they were not supplied, well, clothing won't protect them anyway, and a huge number of them died subsequently of acute radiation illness and cancers, and they developed alcoholism, many suicided, psychotic illnesses, and the like. So that's Chernobyl. This is my book. It's available outside, called Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, which goes through all of this in much more finer detail. Fukushima, I'll start on that. GE built 6 nuclear reactors near an earthquake fault in Fukushima, Mark I GE reactors. I knew the 3 GE engineers who designed those reactors, and they resigned in 1975 in protest, saying these reactors were faulty. They testified before the Congress. Did it make any difference? No, because of the money. The man in charge of GE said, well, we can't stop them because that means the nuclear industry will be over, will be dead. How dare he? And you know, the weapons makers are building the global gas oven now, and so are the fossil fuel companies creating the global gas oven. Why? Because it's money. How dare they do that? How dare they? And I asked them, why are you making cruise missiles? And they'll look at me and say, I'm making money. And I say, but what about your children? You've got young children. And they look at me with eyes like dead stones and they say, I'm making money. And then when they're on their deathbed or their children are dying, they fall into my arms and tell me all the wicked things they've done, because they know. So all through their life, that beautiful soul with which a baby is born, that purity, remains present in every person. And only when they're facing the cold face of death do they then admit that what they've been doing is evil. And I would say evil, because we're destroying the earth. I'm glad this new Pope is into it. What would Jesus do? Here it is. Okay. Now, I don't have a laser beam thing, but of course these screens are way over there. But this is Europe. But there's a black dot up there, and that's Chernobyl. And the very dark red or orange areas are areas where people cannot live anymore. They're so radioactive. And this yellow, and you can see in Sweden, they got a hell of a dose up there, really big. In fact, I went to Sweden just after the accident. Stupidly, I ate reindeer. Reindeer eat lichen, which concentrate the cesium, and the reindeer got very radioactive. I just felt so stupid. But so Norway got a hell of a fallout, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Belarus, parts of England. They had to close down 300 sheep farms in the United Kingdom because the lambs were so full of cesium. And the government said, you've got to close down your farms. And the farmer said, well, for how long? They said, oh, about 100 years. But it's not, it's 600 years. What you also need to know is that Turkey got a huge fallout. I've been to Turkey, they're very agrarian, they make lovely food. But the Turks were so annoyed with Russia, they picked all their radioactive tea and sent it to Russia so they could enjoy the radiation. Don't buy Turkish dried apricots, don't buy Turkish dried tomatoes or anything. Don't buy anything from Turkey, because you don't know which is radioactive and which is not. And as I say, if you buy European food, you don't know if it's going to have cesium in it or strontium or plutonium in it. Do you know what I mean? Okay, this is Fukushima. So I'll just briefly go through it. They built 6 reactors. And what they did was, there was a cliff, but they excavated the cliff to build the reactors at sea level. Behind the 6 reactors is a mountain range, and water pours down from the mountain consistently under the reactors and out to the sea. And when the reactors were intact, that was fine. But what happened was, there was an earthquake. And they lost their external power supply that supplies the pumps to circulate 1 million gallons of water in each of the 6 reactors. Now, because of that circumstance, they put big diesel generators the size of a house underneath the reactors so they switch on and keep the pumps going. But then in came the tsunami, and it drowned the diesel generators. They were so desperate, the men were running out, getting batteries from the cars to try and keep the pumps going. Well, within 3 hours, 3 reactors, units 1, 3, 2 and 3, started to melt down. Because this uranium is so hot and full of these radioactive elements, so hot, it turns into molten radioactive lava, and it melted its way through 6 inches of steel in the reactor containment vessel, down onto the floor, concrete floor, and almost certainly we think it's melted its way through the concrete floor into the earth. And do you remember the China syndrome with Jane Fonda and Jack Hawkins? Yes, the nuclear industry call that the melt through to China syndrome, because it starts going into the earth. Now, the problem is that the water is still pouring down from the mountains, and it pours over these reactor cores, and the water becomes radioactive, very radioactive, and that goes into the ocean. So for 4 years, every day since Fukushima, 400 tons of radioactive water are going to the Pacific. Tons. There is apparently, the nuclear industry never predicted anything like this. They don't know what to do. They can't get near those radioactive cores because if a man stands there for about a couple of seconds, he'll get radiation illness and die. One spent fuel rod, if you stand next to it for a few minutes, you'll get radiation sickness from the gamma radiation coming off from it, right? So, and they send robots in to try and work out what's happening. The robots get fried. It's going to be radioactive like that for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's no way to stop the water coming in from the mountains, dissolving the radioactive elements, and the water's becoming more and more radioactive every day. So what happens is that the algae bioconcentrate cesium or whatever by orders of magnitude. Then the crustaceans eat the algae, same thing. Little fish eat the crustaceans. Big fish, tuna, eat the little fish, and then there's us. So they're already finding fish, tuna in California with Fukushima radiation in it. And it's going to get worse and worse. Now, the Pacific's a very big body of water, and of course the radiation gets diluted, but the solution to pollution by dilution when it comes to radiation is fallacious because of bioconcentration in the food chain. Okay? And I'm in Australia. So there was a hell of a release of radiation initially, and the wind was blowing from west to east across the Pacific. The ambient levels of radiation of noble gases, argon, krypton and xenon, which don't concentrate in the body, but they do get through the lung, and xenon is very fat soluble, tends to concentrate in the fatty abdominal pad and the upper thighs where the gonads, the testicles and ovaries are. Very high energy gamma emitters. I used to use xenon in ventilation perfusion scans in my CF patients. These elements went up 40,000 times above normal in Seattle. Radiation fell in Boston, all over the country. Now, the two air masses of the northern and southern hemisphere don't mix at the equator, so you're the only ones that got the fallout. If there's another earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, the buildings are very fragile. And one of them, 1, 2 or 3, could collapse onto the molten core. God knows what could happen. I told my son in Boston, if that happens, I'm flying you to Australia. He's got 2 little children. And your government is not measuring the ambient levels of air coming over from Fukushima. It's not measuring the sea, and it's not measuring the fish. How dare they? Hillary Clinton signed an agreement just after the accident that you would keep importing food from Japan. I went into a sushi restaurant in New York recently. I said, where are the fish from? Japan. Japan. And the fish are so radioactive along the east coast of Japan, you can't believe it. So never eat Japanese food again. Rice, green tea, miso, vegetables, fish, that's it. No Japanese food, and do not go to Japan, because even if you go to the south, you don't know where the food is being sourced. The government is encouraging the farmers in Fukushima, because it's a rich farming area, to start growing everything again. And they're selling the stuff in London. And Cameron, who's the Prime Minister, you know, he goes and eats some. These people are very stupid. Well, they know no biology, and they're not doctors, and most politicians are scientifically illiterate, and medically illiterate too, I would say. And they're selling it in, you know, Taiwan's banned Japanese food, and another country's just banned it too. Cars being exported from Japan, second-hand cars going to Russia and the like, are being returned because they're so radioactive. Not new cars, but second-hand cars, because the filters into the engine and to the passenger department are very radioactive. If you measure the soil in Tokyo got a hell of a fallout. Some of it is so radioactive it would be classified to be sent to a radioactive waste dump in America. 35 million people live in Tokyo. I know the man, Naoto Kan, who was the Prime Minister. During the height of the accident, he was thinking about evacuating Tokyo. Of course, you couldn't, 35 million people, but a lot of radiation got down there. And so we're just now seeing the tip of the iceberg with the children developing thyroid cancer, but soon there's going to be an epidemic of leukemia and then all sorts of solid cancers of every organ. Like you would transpose Chernobyl data to Japan, because Japan is much more heavily populated, densely, than the areas around Chernobyl. The doctors have been told not to tell their patients that the symptoms could be related to radiation. That's wicked. The new Prime Minister has passed a law to say that any journalist who writes honestly about Fukushima could be jailed for 10 years. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is working with the Fukushima hospital to build a new cancer hospital. That tells you everything. So I'll just walk you through these pictures. So that here's Fukushima before and after the earthquake. And you can see at the bottom, it's a bit hazy, but there are 3 reactors damaged because what happened was, as the heat built up, hydrogen was released from the water, and the hydrogen, of course, is explosive. And there were 3 hydrogen explosions. And at Unit 2 or 3, there was also a nuclear explosion, we think, in the fuel pool, because parts of the fuel are found 20 kilometres away from the reactor containing plutonium. So, okay, here's, just look at that. Can you believe it? That's inside a reactor, but you can't really see that. This is the fallout, and the accident occurred on the 11th of March, 2011. So 7 days later, it's just hitting the west coast of America. Then 10 days later, it's gone right across America and dumped some stuff. And then several days later, it's starting to circle the globe. Incidentally, although the 2 air masses don't mix at the equator, water goes around the Pacific, down your west coast, and now they're finding the radiation in the water in Canada and Seattle and Oregon, and then it'll go down and to Australia. And fish swim a long way, and they don't necessarily follow the currents. So we could be catching radioactive fish in Australia. No one's talking about it. There's a huge press cover-up. Huge. Why? Because the nuclear industry is very powerful. And most of the media don't really understand it anyway. This is just Japan showing, well, what happened was the Japanese knew where the wind then turned and blew towards the Japanese. The Japanese knew where the radiation was going, but they didn't tell the people because they didn't want to create panic. So the people fled into the path of the highest radiation doses. Oh, that's just, and then these are some of the elements, and I've told you about them: cobalt-60, iodine, strontium, cesium, plutonium, uranium. Now, see these ginkgo leaves at the bottom? They've got dead marks on them. That's where, this is in Tokyo, where radiation landed on the ginkgo leaves and killed parts of them. If that was happening, people were breathing the radiation into their lungs, weren't they? And if it's getting into the filters of the cars, it's getting into people's lungs. If you measure the vacuum dust from apartments in Tokyo, it's extremely radioactive. Now, you won't see this very well, but here's a child in the upper corner on the left-hand side from Chernobyl, severely deformed. The other little boy, he's got elephantiasis. He's got huge, huge legs. And then down in the other corner are 2 children, one microcephalic, tiny head, both very mentally retarded, and there are thousands of such cases. This is the book on Chernobyl I talked to you about, which you really should get from the New York Academy of Sciences. It's the most alarming medical book I've ever read in my life, and I've read a lot of medical books. This is a study I commissioned, carbon-free, nuclear-free. By 2030, you can be carbon-free, nuclear-free. Wow. Don't forget that this place is it's a carbon-producing hotel. Every time you walk through those doors, where's your electricity? Or it's a cancer-inducing door. Are you getting your electricity from the reactor at Tampa or coal-fired? Does anyone know? Mostly coal. So all of these are coal global warming doors. They open in front of you. Just be aware that all electricity is created by the burning coal, which is creating the global gas oven. The temperatures might be 6 degrees centigrade hotter by the end of this century, which is antithetical to life. We can't survive at those temperatures. The temperatures in Australia are getting so hot now, I can hardly stand it. Of course, I'm old, but it's really scary. It's really scary, and it's only just started. So be aware how you use electricity. It's not there for the taking. But if you had a solar panel on every building, if you had solar panels on every parking lot, if you had electric cars, you plug them into the solar power during the day and take it back and plug it into the house at night and power up the house. Windmills everywhere. Upgrade your grid. It's so simple. And Americans waste 28% of the electricity they use. Don't ever use a clothes dryer again. Hang your clothes outside in the sun. That's what we do at home. They smell nice. And if you're up in the east and it's cold, hang them by the furnace in the cellar. They dry in a flash. Gee, makes good things for life, like clothes dryers. Or you've got to use one. Dishwashers. Or you've got to use a dishwasher. You can't wash your dishes by hand. How dare we? Oh, carving knives. You just stand there and it goes and carves it. This is so stupid. And you know who pushed the electric house? Was Ronald Reagan, who I spent an hour and a quarter with in the White House alone, trying to teach him about the medical effects of nuclear war. His IQ was about 100, and I came out and said he's got impending Alzheimer's, which he did. So carbon-free, nuclear-free, you can get that if you go to my website, helencaldicott.com, there it is. Now, these are the birds. There's a wonderful evolutionary biologist called Tim Mousseau, who's studying the birds and animals in the exclusion zones of Chernobyl and Fukushima. These are the barn swallows, and they have deformities. You can see little white patches. They're mutations. There are tumours. Number E is a tumour. Their beaks are crooked. The bottom, the tail feathers are abnormal. What happens to birds happens to us. We test all drugs on animals to make sure they're safe for us, because we're all the same biological systems. The work he's doing will be worth a Nobel Prize. He's exposing himself to very high levels of radiation. These are the birds, and they've all got cataracts. Remember I told you radiation causes cataracts? These are the cataracts of the birds. Lenses are opaque. These are the number of nuclear power plants in Europe. And guess what? In the Ukraine, where Chernobyl happened, there are 15 nuclear power plants, and there's a war going on there between Russia and America. And America's pushing Putin into a corner. And for the first time since the Cold War ended, Russia and America are confronting each other militarily. Putin's put his weapons on a higher state of alert, and probably so is America. They're both conducting belligerent, provocative nuclear war exercises near each other's borders. Nuclear war could start tonight by accident, by design. On 9/11, they nearly launched a nuclear war because no one knew what was happening. And a nuclear war, I'll talk about it later, takes an hour to complete. Russian missiles take an hour, half an hour to get to you and half an hour back. There are 60 H-bombs targeted on Washington, D.C. and 10 on New York. There would be lots down here because you've got Disney World. I'm kind of joking. This is a tomato grown near Fukushima. Mutations. Now, these are all the elements in a reactor, and I won't go through them, but you know, you only hear about cesium and strontium and stuff. There are over 200 elements in a reactor, and they all get out when it melts down. And I'm changing it now. See? Lots and lots. There are 8 isotopes of plutonium. Neptunium, americium, curium, californium, berkelium. These are named after the physicists who developed them or where they developed them. And that's it. Now, what I haven't mentioned, and I'm nearly finished, is the radioactive waste. Every year, 30 tonnes of radioactive waste are made in each nuclear power plant around the world. There are over 400 in the world. That waste, according to your EPA, must be stored isolated from the environment for 1 million years. And the nuclear industry has a goal to say they've got the Waste Confidence Act. What does that mean? They've got confidence that in time they will work out how to store radioactive waste safely for 1 million years. How dare they? What idiots! They're worse than Peanuts or, you know, who's the guy who works in the reactor in The Simpsons? Homer. Duh. There's no way to store it safely, and now they're going to put it in Yucca Mountain, which is made of pumice, you know, pumice stones. Very, very porous, yep. Oh, but they've got to put, and it's over an aquifer that supplies Las Vegas. And the stuff's going to leak very shortly. And they're putting it also in Texas. Oh, they put it in poor communities, ecological racism. But imagine this, years hence, people wake and the stuff's going to leak and get into the food. People waking in the morning, the breast milk already radioactive. The baby's being born deformed. Huge incidence of genetic disease. There are 2,600 genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, haemophilia, you name it. They're my specialties. Children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 70. This is the biggest public health hazard the world's ever known, and we've done it to turn on our lights and make nuclear weapons to blow up the planet. The splitting of the atom changed everything save man's mode of thinking. Thus, we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe, and men still think they can fight and kill each other. Killing is over. If we keep killing each other, bombing, killing innocent civilians, blowing babies to bits, we're going to blow ourselves to bits and destroy God's creation. Thank you. Thank you.